You didn't have to fly. You didn't have to summon lightning. You didn't need a broom, a black cloak, or a whispering spellbook. In 16th century Europe, all it took was one unlucky moment. A glance, a cup of tea, a cat, and your fate was sealed. She lived at the edge of town. Alone, but not hidden. Her name, perhaps Anne or Maria or Johanna, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was different. And in those days, being different was dangerous. She'd walk to the market with a basket of herbs slung over her arm, her fingers stained green from picking chamomile, sage, and elderflower. To her, it was tradition. To them, it was suspicion. Someone saw her stroking a black cat as she sat outside her cottage, sipping tea brewed from roots and leaves. That was all. That was enough. Because in a world governed by fear and ignorance, logic bent to paranoia. A black cat wasn't just a pet. It was a familiar, an extension of the devil himself. And that tea? No one asked what it cured. They assumed it poisoned. Healing became hexing. A helpful neighbor turned into a cursed woman in the span of a single evening gossip. If this story moved something inside you, if you believe these women deserve to be remembered, not forgotten, then subscribe to the channel. Every week, we uncover the voices that history tried to silence. And tell me, where are you watching from? I want to know which corners of the world still carry these echoes. What few understand today is just how fragile the line between woman and witch truly was. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that your silence could be mistaken for secrecy, that your kindness might be twisted into manipulation, that if a neighbor's child fell ill or a storm ruined a harvest, eyes would turn to you, not for answers, but for blame. It happened in Germany, it happened in France, it happened in England and Scotland and the Netherlands, and it happened thousands of times, across villages and cities alike with frightening speed. One night, a candle flickers strangely, a cow stops giving milk, a man dreams of demons. The next morning, you are at the center of it all. The villagers gather. Whispers swell into murmurs, then into declarations. She always walks in the woods. She talks to herself. She wears dark clothes. Every detail, once meaningless, becomes damning. And as your hands are tied, no one speaks for you. Not your friend, not your sister, not your priest, because to defend a witch is to risk being one. Superstition was never passive in Western Europe. It was a weapon sharpened by the church, wielded by the community, and thrust into the hearts of those who couldn't fight back. In 1588, in Trier, Germany, entire neighborhoods were emptied of women. Over 300 people were burned in one single city. In Scotland, the North Berwick witch trials saw dozens tortured after a storm disrupted King James's 66 voyage, an act blamed on sorcery. And in England, the Pendle Hill case began when one woman asked another for a pin. A pin. She was refused. Days later, the woman who said no fell ill. That was the story. That was enough. The accused were often healers, midwives, herbalists, women who understood nature, cycles, the body. But their knowledge, passed from mother to daughter for generations, became a threat in the eyes of a society clinging to control. Even simple skills, like knowing how to ease childbirth or soothe a fever, became evidence of unnatural power. And if you think it was just the uneducated masses fueling these flames, you'd be wrong. University-trained theologians wrote treatises explaining why women were more susceptible to the devil's seduction. Learned men claimed that female anatomy made them spiritually weaker, more prone to lust, and therefore more likely to conspire with darkness. The same hands that baptized children would light the fires under their mothers. But the greatest horror wasn't the burning. It was the moment before, when the world around you, your own neighbors, transformed, when the people who once shared bread with you turned their backs, when your child was told not to call you mother anymore. Fear turned communities into predators. Survival demanded silence. And the easiest way to deflect suspicion was to accuse someone else first. So, you see, you didn't have to do anything wicked. All you had to do was exist, in the wrong place, with the wrong habits, seen by the wrong person. And if you had the misfortune of being a woman who asked too many questions, or knew too much about plants, or lived alone with a black cat, your days were numbered. Even your dreams could betray you. There are records, real official transcripts, of women sentenced because they dreamed of flying, or felt a strange wind during prayer, or had a nightmare about a goat. In courts where justice bowed to hysteria, sleep became a liability. Children were interrogated. Infants were examined for witches' marks. Husbands were encouraged to report their wives. And if you were poor, sick, or simply disliked, you were already halfway buried. The execution didn't always come quickly. Many languished in prisons first, cold, damp, and infested, chained in darkness, denied food, denied hope. And those lucky enough to stand trial were rarely given a chance to speak. Their fate was decided before they walked through the door. In one account from Bamberg, Germany, a woman named Christina Moorhaupt was arrested with her daughter Barbara. Christina was accused of attending a witch's Sabbath, a feast with the devil. She denied it, but after days of relentless torture, her body broken, she confessed. So did her daughter. Their confessions, scribbled in Latin, were copied and distributed. As proof, as warning. They were burned side by side. Their crime? Someone dreamt of them. But the most chilling part isn't the fire or the screams. It's the silence that came afterward. The eerie calm, the acceptance, the return to normal as if nothing had happened. As if they were never there. Because for every woman accused, there were dozens who stayed quiet, who learned not to speak too loudly, who hid their knowledge, who buried their talents, who stopped picking herbs, who stopped singing to themselves, who stopped being seen. What was lost in those flames wasn't just life, it was wisdom, memory, legacy. And still, the smoke never fully cleared. Of all the weapons used in the hunt for witches, none was more dangerous than belief. And belief needed fuel, fear, tradition, scripture, and something even more insidious, instruction. By the late 1400s, the witch hunts in Europe had become organized, systematic, and terrifyingly efficient. And a large part of that machinery came in the form of a book. Its title, translated from Latin, was The Hammer of Witches, Malleus Maleficarum, written by two inquisitors of the Catholic Church, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Springer. What began as a treatise became a manual for mass persecution, endorsed by both church and state, printed in thousands of copies, and spread like wildfire across the continent. This book didn't just accuse, it taught. Page after page, it explained why witches were real, why they were a threat, and how to find, question, and destroy them. And behind its scholarly language and theological citations lay a single obsessive theme: women. According to the Malleus, women were weak-minded, lustful, envious, and naturally drawn to evil. Their words carried poison. Their touch spread death. Their sexuality, especially when uncontrolled, was a doorway for the devil. The text argued that women, more than men, made pacts with demons because they were more credulous and more impressionable, and thus more dangerous. This wasn't metaphor. It was law. Courts in Germany, Switzerland, France, Italy, and England used the book to guide interrogations. If a woman had a birthmark, it could be a witch's teat, used to suckle familiars. If she had a miscarriage, evidence of unnatural interference. If her neighbor's crops failed, surely she had cursed them. Worse still, the Malleus outlined procedures that made conviction nearly inevitable. It advised that torture was not only acceptable but necessary, and that confession under pain was valid, even encouraged. If a woman withstood torture without confessing, that was not a sign of innocence, but proof of Satan's protection. This logic, brutal, circular, and self-justifying, ensured that once accused, a woman's chances of survival dropped to near zero. It wasn't just about theology. These beliefs trickled into the collective mindset of everyday people. Imagine being a midwife in a small village. You help a woman through childbirth, and the baby is born with a deformity. Whispers begin. What should have been gratitude curdles into suspicion. The pain of birth must have been punishment. The strange appearance of the child? A curse? And you? A witch? There are records of such cases. In one English village, a midwife was executed because a baby she delivered had a cleft lip. In another, a woman was accused after a child she had blessed fell ill days later. Blessings, once sacred, became threats. Every act of kindness was weighed against the potential for evil. But not all accusations came from disaster. Some came from jealousy. In Denmark, a woman who inherited her late husband's land was accused by her brother-in-law of bewitching him. In France, a widow who remarried too quickly, or too happily, was labeled a temptress. A woman with wealth? Dangerous. A woman with beauty? Distrustful. A woman with both? Condemned. The witch hunts were rarely about witches. They were about power. Who had it, who didn't, and how easily it could be taken. And then there was the question of evidence. In modern courts, evidence means proof. Documents, witnesses, facts. But during the witch trials, evidence could be a rumor, a dream, or even the twitch of an eye. Testimonies were often hearsay. Someone said they saw a woman in the woods talking to herself. Someone claimed to hear strange noises near her cottage. Someone felt cursed after an argument. In Scotland, one woman was convicted because her neighbor's butter wouldn't churn. No spell was seen. No magic was done. But the butter wouldn't form, and that, to them, was enough. Their stories were nearly lost forever. But you're here, listening. That means something. Hit the subscribe button if you believe the past still matters. And drop a comment below. What country, what city are you watching from? Let's see how far their voices have reached. To ensure justice, authorities created tests. Grotesque methods meant to uncover guilt. The swimming test, for instance, the accused would be bound and thrown into water. If she floated, she was guilty. Water, being pure, was said to reject witches. If she sank, she was innocent, and likely drowned. In another test, women were pricked with needles to find the devil's mark, an insensitive spot that wouldn't bleed. Sometimes the needles were rigged, the examiners were paid, and the victims, terrified, often confessed just to make it stop. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of these trials was the silence of those watching. People saw their neighbors dragged from their homes. They heard the screams through the prison walls. They watched smoke rise over the trees. And most of them said nothing, because they feared the fire too, because belief is contagious, because it's easier to pretend you don't see the rope until it's around your own neck. It's important to understand that not everyone in Europe agreed with the hunts. There were scholars, clergy, and even kings who opposed the madness. But their voices were often drowned out by the roar of the crowd, the crackle of flames, and the promises of salvation offered by those who claimed to protect souls by destroying bodies. This is how entire communities came to accept, even embrace, the burning of their own. It's also why the witch hunts spread so far, so fast. Once belief took root, it was nearly impossible to uproot. Towns competed to purge themselves of evil. Judges built careers on high conviction rates. Informers were rewarded, and once a few women burned, the fear multiplied. It was only a matter of time before every village had its own trial, its own scaffold, its own graveyard of accused witches. And while all this unfolded in courts and cathedrals, something darker crept through the daily lives of women. They began to self-police, to silence their voices, to avoid attention, to forget the old songs, to stop touching the earth the way their mothers had taught them. Because being too free, too curious, too capable, meant being at risk. The flame didn't just kill the body, it scorched generations of memory, and yet, as belief spread like a plague, it left behind something else, something more dangerous than superstition, a question that no one dared to ask aloud, one that lingered in the hearts of those still breathing. Who would be next? They called it a trial, but there were no scales of justice, no presumption of innocence, no chance for redemption. Once the word witch left someone's mouth, it entered a courtroom already tilted like a gallows, leaning forward, eager to drop. The accused would stand, or more often collapse, in front of a panel of judges. Some were clergy, others were local nobles, or state-appointed interrogators. But titles meant little. What they truly were in that moment were executioners cloaked in ritual. Their task wasn't to uncover truth, it was to extract a confession, by any means necessary. At the heart of this machinery was torture. Systematic, legal, blessed torture. And here lies one of the most disturbing truths about the witch trials in Western Europe. Pain was considered proof. If a woman cried out under torment, it was seen as a reaction to holy purification. If she withstood the agony in silence, that was worse. Proof that Satan had hardened her flesh. There was no outcome that meant innocence. The very act of surviving interrogation became its own kind of guilt. In Bamberg, Würzburg, Trier, cities that now attract tourists with cobblestone streets and medieval churches, women and men alike were shackled in iron, stretched on racks, starved in underground cells, beaten, burned, and broken. There are court records that describe, in chilling detail, the screams, the shattered bones, the teeth falling from clenched jaws. One of the most infamous devices was the strappado. The victims' hands were tied behind their back, and they were hoisted by a rope into the air, then dropped suddenly. Their shoulders dislocated instantly. It was a standard procedure, not an exception. In other cases, the accused were forced to sit on the chair. Not a throne, but a metal seat lined with spikes, heated until the flesh blistered and bled. Or they were subjected to sleep deprivation, which sounds mild until you realize it involved days without rest, bright lights in the eyes, sharp sounds repeated endlessly, all designed to drive the mind into desperation. Confessions always followed. How could they not? Imagine being held in a cell that stank of blood and mold, your body broken, your mind frayed by pain and fear, and a man in robes asking you to name your crime. What choice did you have? Some tried to hold on. They bit their tongues. They cried out to God. They begged for mercy. Others gave in. They told stories they thought the judges wanted to hear, of flying at night, of kissing the devil, of feasting at Sabbaths with strange animals and witches in shadowy glades. It didn't matter whether it was real, it only mattered that it was said, and once it was said, it was written, recorded, copied, shared. These confessions, collected under agony, became the foundation of further hunts. See, the authorities would say, she admitted to consorting with demons. She named others. The devil walks among us. Every confession planted the seed of 10 more accusations. A single scream could echo across an entire village for years. In some places, witch prisons were built, not just rooms, but entire buildings designed to hold dozens of accused at once. In Eichstätt, Germany, a tower was erected solely to detain suspected witches. Inside, iron bars separated cells the size of closets. One small window, high and barred. No fire, no food unless paid for. Many died before they were ever tried. In these spaces, women turned on one another, not from cruelty, but from survival. Under pressure, names spilled from their mouths. Sisters, daughters, friends. Each name a desperate attempt to stop the pain. And every time a name was given, the wheel turned again. This is how the system fed itself. Torture created confession. Confession created accusation. Accusation created fear. And fear justified more torture. But the violence didn't end in the chamber. The trial itself, if one can call it that, was a performance. The accused was paraded in front of the public, sometimes gagged to prevent her from casting spells. Her hands were bound in case she formed devil signs. People came to watch, not out of hatred always, but because they were taught this was justice, righteousness. And there, in that courtroom, the woman stood before questions designed to trap her. Why do you know the names of herbs that can cause miscarriage? Why did the neighbor's child die after you touched her forehead? Have you ever had a dream of darkness? There were no good answers. To deny was to mock the court. To confess was to seal your fate. And sometimes even silence was treated as defiance, a sin of pride. Many confessed not just for themselves, but to protect their children, to end the suffering, to die quickly. But the truth is, death rarely came quickly. Once condemned, a woman could be stripped, shaved, and paraded through the streets. Her name etched into documents, church records, whispered into sermons. If she had family, they were marked. If she had children, they were stained with her memory. Some were burned alive. Others were strangled first, then burned. A mercy of sorts. In England, burning was rare. Hanging was more common. But in Central Europe, the fire reigned. And as the flames rose, the same crowd who had once bought eggs from her, who had asked her for healing balms or prayers, stood and watched. Why didn't more resist? Why did entire villages accept this? Because the system didn't only punish the accused. It warned the living. If you spoke too loudly, you might be next. If you defended her, you must be in league with her. And so the world shrank. The space between life and suspicion grew razor thin. A look, a word, a rumor, any of it could become a match. There's a documented case from Switzerland where a man tried to defend his sister, accused of witchcraft. He argued with trembling hands that she was a devout Christian, a kind woman, incapable of the horrors described. A week later, he was arrested. He died in prison, no trial. In a world ruled by terror, disguised as justice, the safest thing you could do was nothing at all. And still, the pain didn't end when the fire burned out. The legacy lingered in the haunted silence left behind, in the daughters who grew up afraid to speak too boldly, to think too freely, in the mothers who taught their children never to stand out, never to be too clever, too curious, too loud, because what had once been flesh and bone had become a warning, a scar etched into the conscience of a continent. A reminder that the line between ordinary woman and witch was not real, but the punishment for crossing it absolutely was. And that punishment was far from over. She knew things she wasn't supposed to know. That was her crime. She could recognize fever before it burned the skin. She understood the rhythm of a woman's womb, the ache behind a man's coughing fit, the healing power of roots and flowers pressed into a warm cloth. She knew how to ease pain, how to deliver a child safely into the world, how to prepare a tonic that soothed the body or calmed the mind. And in a time when medicine was crude, superstitious, and mostly reserved for the rich, that kind of knowledge was both a miracle and a threat. Midwives, herbalists, widows, women who had lived long enough to gather wisdom and were bold enough to use it. These were the ones the flames sought first, because knowledge, especially female knowledge, was dangerous in a world obsessed with control. Particularly in rural villages across Western Europe, it was often these women, not priests or physicians, who were the first responders to illness, childbirth, or injury. They held the trust of generations. They passed down what they had learned not through books, but through stories, rituals, touch, and memory. They knew that yarrow stopped bleeding, that mugwort calmed a troubled belly, that fennel and lavender could ease childbirth. They weren't casting spells. They were surviving. But survival in those years became a radical act. The church, uncomfortable with their autonomy, began to view these women not as helpers, but as heretics. After all, healing without priestly intervention suggested that divine grace wasn't necessary. Worse, it placed power, real, practical, observable power, into the hands of women. That alone was intolerable. Male physicians, who had begun organizing into professional guilds, felt similarly threatened. They sought to formalize medicine, to claim authority over the human body, and they didn't want competition from women working outside their rules, especially women who often had better results. So the campaign began, quiet at first, then louder. The language shifted. A midwife didn't just ease labor, she meddled with the natural order. An herbalist wasn't a healer. She was a poisoner in disguise. A wise woman wasn't wise. She was consorting with demons. The seeds of suspicion took root. And when something went wrong, and in those times something always went wrong, it was easy to point fingers. A mother hemorrhages after childbirth. The midwife made a mistake. Or worse, she meant to. A child dies in the night from infection. Someone must have cursed him. The fever came after drinking that tea. Clearly, the tea was not medicine, but sorcery. One of the most infamous cases comes from 1620s Würzburg, Germany. Katharina Hennot, A postmistress, rare in itself, a woman with an official role, was known for her confidence, independence, and healing knowledge. She was accused of bewitching a nun, arrested, and tortured. She denied all charges, even under extreme pain. But the court refused to accept her silence. They took it as defiance. She was burned alive in public. To this day, no one knows exactly why she was targeted. Some say it was political, others point to jealousy. But what's certain is this: she was intelligent, respected, and female, and that, in 17th century Europe, was often reason enough. Another common thread among those accused was age. Older women, especially widows, had few protectors. No husband to defend them, no sons to threaten revenge. Their solitude was spun into suspicion. Why does she live alone? Why does she speak to the birds? Why does she wander the fields at night? Perhaps the most chilling aspect was how quickly admiration turned to fear. A woman praised one year for her herbal remedies could be condemned the next for the very same skill. Reverence was fragile. All it took was one misfortune: a bad harvest, a dying animal, a sudden illness, and the community's gratitude could curdle into hatred. In some regions, being helpful was literally written into indictments. She was known to aid women in childbirth. She made teas for the sick. She provided herbs that could end a pregnancy. All of these are quotes from real trial records. None of them describe crimes, but under the eyes of suspicious men desperate for control, these acts became monstrous. And there was something deeper at work too: a fear of female autonomy. A woman who could cure without the church, earn income without a man, and live without male supervision was a disruption to the carefully designed social hierarchy. In an era where a woman's virtue was tied to obedience and silence, these women were living proof that freedom was possible, and that terrified people more than any spell. That fear seeped into law. In 1542, Henry VIII passed England's first Witchcraft Act, criminalizing sorcery and making it punishable by death. Though initially aimed at those invoking evil spirits, the law was quickly used to go after midwives, especially those accused of using spells or charms during birth. Similar patterns unfolded across Europe. In France, a physician might diagnose a patient with bewitchment simply because they couldn't explain the symptoms. In Scotland, entire towns were searched for signs of unnatural behavior, and often the most knowledgeable women were the ones taken away first. Even the remedies themselves became suspect. If a woman brewed a tea to calm nerves and it worked too well, evidence of witchcraft. If she made a poultice for pain and it didn't work, proof of malicious failure. Damned if you heal, damned if you don't. Perhaps the most tragic irony is this: these women, labeled witches and monsters, were often the most compassionate, skilled, and selfless members of their communities. They didn't crave power. They used what they knew to ease suffering. But in a time when suffering was seen as holy and healing without permission was a crime, their very compassion became their curse, and the women who watched them burn learned the lesson well. Be quiet. Be obedient. Forget what your grandmother taught you. Don't pick flowers unless someone sees you. Don't speak of the moon. Don't hum when you stir the pot. Don't help the neighbor too much or too little. Don't be too old or too young or too beautiful or too strange. Stay small. Stay forgettable. Because knowledge was dangerous. But being a woman with knowledge, that was deadly. She didn't need to cast a spell. She only needed to be poor, old, and alone. That was enough. In the social hierarchy of early modern Europe, the lowest rung belonged to the forgotten: the elderly widow, the unmarried sister, the childless woman. Without a husband to speak for her or sons to protect her, she became vulnerable, not just to hardship, but to accusation. If her roof leaked, she was a burden. If she begged for bread, she was a nuisance. And if the cow died the next day, she was a witch. Poverty was a curse long before any incantation. Throughout the 15th to 17th centuries, Europe was ravaged by waves of famine, disease, and war. Crops failed, plagues spread, inflation soared. Villages were stripped of young men by endless conflicts, and those left behind, especially older women, became easy scapegoats for the misfortunes no one could explain. Accusations often followed a chilling pattern. A woman asks for help. She's denied. Something bad happens. She's blamed. In one documented case from Essex, England, an old woman named Agnes Waterhouse was turned away after asking for milk. A few days later, the family's cat died. That coincidence was all the proof they needed. She was arrested, tried, and executed. Her crime? Hunger followed by misfortune. She never stood a chance. Across Western Europe, hundreds of similar stories repeated with eerie consistency. A woman lives alone. Her husband died years ago. Her children, if she had any, have moved on. She keeps to herself. Maybe she talks to birds. Maybe she sings to herself while hanging herbs to dry. Maybe she still wears black out of mourning even years later. It doesn't matter. She's poor. She's old. And no one would come to her defense. In fact, in many places, the very act of defending someone accused of witchcraft could lead to your own arrest. Solidarity was dangerous. Silence became survival. There's something deeply human and deeply terrifying about how quickly communities turned on the weakest among them. It wasn't always out of malice. Sometimes it was fear, sometimes it was the desperate desire to explain the unexplainable, but more often it was convenience. When times got hard, someone had to pay. And who better than the one who couldn't fight back? Elderly women, particularly those past childbearing age, were viewed with suspicion not just because of what they did, but because of what they no longer were. They were no longer mothers, no longer wives, no longer useful to a patriarchal society that measured a woman's value in terms of fertility and obedience, and in the absence of those roles, they became eerie symbols of the unknown: cracked voices, wrinkled hands, mysterious ailments, memory, longevity. All of it became unnerving, unnatural. And then there was envy. A younger woman sees the old widow with a bit of land, perhaps the last remnant of her husband's inheritance. A neighbor envies her herbs, her chickens, her sturdy fence. A cousin wants the tiny patch of field she's managed to maintain on her own. What's the fastest way to remove her? A whisper, a rumor, an accusation, land theft under the guise of piety. It happened everywhere. In Germany, entire villages were emptied of elderly women after just a few accusations. In parts of Switzerland, specific witch houses were built to hold them while awaiting trial. Some were held there for years. No judgment, no conviction, just slow decay. And the truly horrifying part? Many of these women confessed, not because they believed it, but because after weeks, sometimes months, of starvation, beatings, and isolation, they lost the ability to distinguish between what was real and what would end the pain. They were promised a quick death if they admitted to flying through the sky or feeding a cat with blood. They were promised salvation if they named others. They often did. There's something haunting in the way survival twisted into betrayal. One woman's confession could doom 5 more. Not out of malice, but because it was the only bargain left to make. We often imagine witches as defiant, powerful, cackling at the world's judgment. But the reality was much quieter, much sadder. Many of the so-called witches never raised their voices, never resisted. They simply sat in cold corners of dark cells, staring at the floor, wondering how the world turned so cruel. They weren't spellcasters. They were scapegoats. Their names rarely survive. Their faces were never painted. Their stories live in court records, buried beneath layers of official language and secondhand testimony. But if you read closely, you find the fragments of who they were. A woman who asked for a crust of bread. A woman who lost her son in a war. A woman who sang a lullaby too loud one night. A woman who owned a cat. A woman who didn't smile enough. In 1597, in Scotland, a woman named Margaret Aitken was arrested and tortured. Under pressure, she confessed to being a witch and, to save herself, claimed she could identify others by sight alone. The authorities believed her. She was taken town to town, pointing out witches from crowds. Hundreds of them. Many were arrested, tortured, and killed based on her word alone. Eventually, someone tested her. They brought her back to a village she had already visited and presented her with the same women. This time, she gave different names. Her credibility crumbled. She was executed soon after. But by then, over 400 people had been accused based on her desperate confessions. The domino effect was catastrophic, and it began with one frightened, desperate woman trying to survive. It's easy to see the witch hunts as historical oddities, something dark and distant, but the psychology behind them isn't gone. The fear of the outsider, the need to assign blame, the comfort found in scapegoating the weak, these instincts haven't vanished. They've only changed shape. And the memory of those forgotten women, the poor, the old, the lonely, lingers in the soil of every European village that once lit a fire in the town square. Their lives were quiet, their deaths were loud. But what's loudest now is the silence that followed. The silence of generations too afraid to ask what really happened, too ashamed to remember. They called it justice, but it was spectacle. The fires weren't lit in secret. They weren't hidden away in forests or whispered about behind closed doors. They were staged, choreographed, and placed at the center of towns, timed for maximum effect. People were told when and where the execution would happen. Families brought children. Merchants sold bread and ale. The priest stood ready with prayers, and the crowd gathered like it was a fair. This was the true face of punishment during the witch hunts of Western Europe. Not swift justice, but public theater, designed not just to kill, but to terrify. The burning of a witch was never just about the individual. It was about control. It was about sending a message. And that message was simple. Step out of line, and this could be you. In cities like Bamberg, Trier, and Würzburg, the air grew heavy with smoke, not from war, not from harvest, but from the execution grounds. In smaller villages, the ritual was just as deliberate. The pyre was built tall. Wood was stacked carefully, often laced with pitch to burn faster. The platform was raised so everyone could see. The accused was brought out in chains, usually in tattered clothes. Her hair, if not shaved, was matted from days or weeks of imprisonment. Sometimes she was gagged, not because she was dangerous, but because her last words might sway hearts. And they couldn't risk that. Silence was safer. Some were burned alive. Others were strangled first, then set ablaze. It depended on local customs or whether the judges felt merciful. But mercy was a luxury. For most, the final moments were consumed by heat and screams and the crackle of bone. But the execution itself was only half the event. What came before was equally grotesque. The procession. The condemned woman was paraded through the town, flanked by guards, watched by neighbors who once shared bread with her. Children pointed. Men muttered prayers. Women looked away, sometimes out of pity, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of the desperate need to believe that it was her, not them. And while the flames consumed her, sermons echoed over the smoke. Preachers used the moment to warn others, to declare that God's justice had been done, to reaffirm that evil had been rooted out. They read aloud the crimes, many of them invented, many confessed under torture, all of them woven into the myth of the witch. Flying at night, dancing with demons, killing infants, causing storms, making men impotent. The stories were horrifying, but more horrifying still was how easily they were believed, not because people were foolish, but because belief offered comfort. If evil had a face, it could be destroyed. If suffering had a cause, it could be named. If the devil lived among them, he could be burned out. And so the flames continued. In 1587, in the German town of Ellwangen, more than 150 people were accused in just a few months. Many were burned. A single rumor, a child falling ill, a cow giving birth to a deformed calf, could set the entire process in motion. Fire followed fire, and always the people watched. It's tempting to imagine the crowd as bloodthirsty, but the truth is more complex. Many came because they were told it was their duty, to witness, to learn, to protect themselves. And some came because not attending might seem suspicious, not reacting correctly, not looking disgusted, not praying loud enough, not condemning hard enough, could be dangerous. In that world, fear didn't just silence, it performed. Even after the ashes cooled, the message lingered. Children grew up with the memory of smoke. Women learned to lower their eyes. Healers hid their remedies. Midwives whispered their prayers. Communities buried their questions, layer by layer, until silence felt like safety. But what's most chilling is how quickly the spectacle became ordinary. In the city of Loudun, France, the 1630s saw a particularly gruesome case. After a group of nuns claimed to be possessed, a priest named Urbain Grandier was accused of witchcraft. The trial was public, the execution was public, and the documents, transcripts, accusations, signed pacts with Satan, clearly forged, were copied and displayed. People came from miles around to see it. It wasn't just justice, it was entertainment. The burning of witches became ritualized trauma, and like all rituals, it left marks. Physical marks on the ground where fires had burned, emotional marks in the minds of those who watched, generational marks in the stories passed down, or silenced. Even today, if you walk through some European towns, you'll find plaques, stones, small markers where someone, often nameless, was executed for witchcraft. Some have been polished, others are ignored, but they stand as reminders of what once passed for order. The fire wasn't about purifying sin, it was about erasing power. It destroyed not only bodies, but legacies, the knowledge those women carried, the stories they could have told, the lives they might have shaped. And perhaps that was the point, because a woman who knew too much was a threat. A woman who was too much, too bold, too wise, too loud, had to be made into an example. And examples are always most effective when everyone is watching. But beneath the crackling wood and the sermons and the smoke, something else was smoldering, something even the fire couldn't consume entirely. Memory, and memory, like a spark, can spread, quietly, slowly, until it lights a different kind of flame. And not all flames are meant to destroy. There was a judge, there were scribes, there was a courtroom and a process that looked like justice. But once a woman was accused of witchcraft in early modern Europe, the outcome was never really in question. The sentence hovered in the air long before she entered the room, like smoke curling from a fire that hadn't yet been lit. This wasn't a trial. It was a ritual, a performance with a pre-written ending. And for the accused, it felt like being trapped inside a story where every word you spoke only pushed you closer to the fire. She would be brought in, shackled, disoriented, often starved, her face pale from weeks in the dungeon, her voice hoarse from screams. The court would already have testimony against her, perhaps from a jealous neighbor, a scorned relative, or a frightened child. And behind the table sat men, robed, righteous, and deaf to anything except confirmation. The questions began. Do you believe in God? Have you ever danced under the moon? Why were you seen gathering herbs at night? Each question was a trap, carefully designed to ensure guilt. Denial was pride. Silence was defiance. Confession was damnation. And every answer was twisted into something darker. If she said yes, she prayed, she believed, she loved God, then why had misfortune followed her? If she said no, if she hesitated, if she wept, if she broke, then surely Satan had her soul. And if someone had already confessed her name under torture, then the trial was nothing but a cruel formality. Her fate was sealed by another woman's scream. In many cases, she wasn't allowed to speak at all. In Scotland, where witch trials reached a fever pitch in the 16th and 17th centuries, a device known as the branks, or scold's bridle, was used to silence accused women. It was a metal cage placed over the head with a piece that forced down the tongue, ensuring no defense, no spell, no final plea. The image is haunting. A woman forced to stand in front of her accusers, unable to speak, while men debated the best way to end her life. Even when she was allowed to speak, her words carried no weight. The court relied heavily on spectral evidence. Dreams, visions, strange feelings. A neighbor might say, "I saw her in my sleep, riding a goat," or "She appeared to me as a cat and cursed my crops." No proof was needed. The accusation was the proof. This wasn't madness, it was strategy. By relying on invisible crimes, courts didn't need facts. They only needed belief, and enough pressure to keep the community afraid of questioning the process. And what if she tried to fight back? What if she challenged the court? In 1591, in North Berwick, Scotland, a woman named Agnes Sampson was accused of raising a storm that nearly sank King James VI's ship. She was tortured until she confessed to meeting the devil and conspiring with other witches. But even then, she refused to go quietly. She confronted her accusers, denied the wildest charges, demanded witnesses. The court responded by shaving her entire body in search of the devil's mark and subjecting her to more torture. She was eventually strangled and burned. Her resistance didn't save her, but it terrified the judges, because a woman speaking clearly, intelligently, fearlessly was the most threatening thing of all. And this fear of female voice, female defiance, was built into the entire structure of the trials. Women weren't just being punished for imaginary crimes. They were being punished for refusing to be small, silent, or submissive. Take the case of Alce Young, the first woman executed for witchcraft in the American colonies. She was hanged in Hartford, Connecticut in 1647. No trial record survives, but historians believe she was a midwife, possibly with strong opinions and a sharp tongue. In Puritan society, that alone could be fatal. Or look at the Englishwoman Joan Wright, accused in the 1620s. She was a midwife, yes, but also left-handed and known to speak her mind. When babies died in her care, people whispered. When more followed, she was arrested. She was different, and different was dangerous. The trials weren't about evidence, they were about conformity. And perhaps nothing reveals this more than the pressure placed on the accused to confess, even when they had done nothing wrong. Confession wasn't just expected, it was required. It was the endpoint the court was moving toward from the first moment. And if it didn't come willingly, it would be forced. There are accounts of women confessing to impossible things, flying over cities, turning into animals, speaking languages they never learned, consorting with mythical demons. They said what the court wanted to hear, not because they believed it, but because they wanted it to end, because they were promised a quicker death, or, in some twisted cases, the chance to live, if they named others. This is how the trial spread, not through logic or evidence, but through the wildfire of coerced testimony. One woman confesses and names 3. Those 3 are arrested, tortured, and name 9. 9 become 20, and suddenly a whole village is infected with accusation. Each trial was a match, each confession, dry kindling. In Bamberg, Germany, over 600 people were executed during a single wave of witch trials between 1626 and 1631. One woman's trial record contained the names of over 100 others she confessed to meeting at witches' sabbaths. The court believed every word, because it wanted to believe. And for those watching, the message was clear. Don't stand out. Don't speak too loudly. Don't help too many. Don't question the church, the law, the judge, the priest. Because once you were inside that courtroom, there was no path back. Even innocence became its own kind of guilt. There's a Latin phrase scrawled in the margins of one 17th century trial transcript. Silentium est confessio. Silence is confession. And so women stopped defending themselves. They stopped resisting. They accepted the script handed to them, because there was no role for the innocent, only for the condemned. But still, there were cracks. Occasionally, someone did push back. A judge with a conscience, a town priest with doubts, a husband unwilling to let his wife be taken. And sometimes, very rarely, the tide shifted. A trial was halted, an execution postponed. The crowd murmured, uncertain. Because even in the darkest chapters, the truth has a way of leaking in. Through doubt, through pain, through the terrible aching question that echoed in every silent courtroom. What if we were wrong? It didn't take a priest. It didn't take a judge. Sometimes, all it took to destroy a woman's life was a whisper from across the fence. Because long before she stood before a tribunal or faced the flames, the accusations began in the kitchens, in the markets, at the well, in the quiet spaces where daily life happened and fear passed from mouth to mouth like gossip dressed as truth. The witch trials were not only the work of institutions. They were fueled by ordinary people, husbands, wives, children, neighbors, all caught in a storm of suspicion, jealousy, and self-preservation. And the most disturbing part? Many of them believed they were doing the right thing. Picture a village in 17th century England. Small, isolated, superstitious. The harvest fails. A child falls ill. Milk spoils too quickly. These weren't just inconveniences, they were signs, omens. And when fear needed a shape, it often took the form of someone familiar. Maybe it was the old widow who muttered to herself. Maybe it was the girl who kept too many cats. Maybe it was the healer who never came to church. Maybe it was your own mother. Children were not exempt from the hysteria. In fact, they were often its most tragic instruments. Many courts, especially in Scotland and parts of Germany, treated children's testimonies as holy truths. Children were considered pure, less likely to lie, more sensitive to spiritual forces. So when a young boy pointed a finger at the woman who had scolded him for stealing apples, his words held power, real power. In the infamous Pendle witch trials of 1612 in Lancashire, England, the central testimony came from a 9-year-old girl, Janet Device, who accused her own mother, brother, and sister of witchcraft. Her words, rehearsed and encouraged by authorities, led to 10 executions. Years later, she was accused in another wave of trials, proof that even the protected were eventually devoured by the machine they fed. But what's even more unsettling is how often accusations were driven not by fear of the devil, but by human bitterness. In French towns like Labour and Bordeaux, neighbors accused neighbors after petty arguments. Disputes over land, inheritance, or stolen livestock turned into accusations of curses and dark rituals. A woman refused to share her recipe for preserving meat. She must be hiding something. A man rejected a marriage proposal. His new bride falls ill and obviously hexed. Jealousy became a spark, vengeance, the fuel. In some cases, men accused their wives, not because they believed them to be witches, but because they wanted to remarry, claim their dowries, or rid themselves of inconvenient partners. In regions of Germany, there are documented cases of husbands petitioning local authorities with stories of strange behavior, nightmares, infertility, unusual tempers, all presented as evidence of witchcraft. The state didn't need much convincing, because once the rumors began, the accused became contaminated. Not by magic, but by stigma. People stopped speaking to her, refused to sell her goods, crossed themselves when she passed by. Children ran away, dogs snarled. Even without trial, she was already erased. That kind of isolation was its own kind of execution, and those watching learned quickly how to protect themselves. Don't associate with the accused. Don't question the process. Don't say the wrong thing. Because the moment you did, suspicion could swing like a blade in your direction. And so the community turned inward, a network of eyes, ears, and silent calculations. A woman accused another not always out of hate, but because she thought it might save her family. A man condemned his neighbor not because he believed in demons, but because the grain was rotting and something had to be done. And sometimes, entire families fed one another to the flames, link by link, praying the chain would end before it reached them. This is how the witch hunts sustained themselves, not just through authority, but through desperation. The records from Würzburg and Bamberg tell us as much. In both towns, waves of accusations spread like wildfire through households and neighborhoods. One woman, tortured, would name 5 others. Those 5 would name 10. Husbands turned on wives. Children testified against mothers. Friends dissolved into informants. The fear was contagious, and survival demanded sacrifice. But there were moments, rare, fragile moments, when someone tried to stop the tide. In a 1647 case from Essex, England, a man named John Bradshaw defended a neighbor accused of bewitching his cow. He told the court the woman was kind, pious, incapable of such evil. He swore under oath. Days later, he was arrested for consorting with witches. He died in prison. His cow? It recovered on its own. It wasn't just neighbors and families who failed the accused. The church, too, became complicit. Priests encouraged confessions to save souls, promising absolution through fire. Sermons described the devil as hiding in plain sight. In your village, your home, your bloodline. Every illness became a curse, every misstep a sign of sin. Faith became fear in disguise. Even the dead weren't spared. In some villages, corpses were exhumed, burned, or mutilated if they were believed to have been witches in life. If a child died suddenly and someone remembered a woman looking at him strangely, that woman, even if buried, might be dug up, retried, and posthumously punished. The paranoia knew no bounds, no logic, no mercy. And yet, despite the horror, the cycle often ended the same way, with regret, quiet, decay. Years later, when the smoke had cleared and the madness faded, communities began to whisper what they had long buried. She wasn't a witch. Maybe she was sick. Maybe she was strange. Maybe she was just unlucky, but not a witch. In Salem, Massachusetts, one of the few witch hunts with extensive surviving records, apologies were eventually issued. Decades after the trials, some of the judges expressed remorse. Survivors were offered financial compensation, but the dead remained dead, and those who had once pointed fingers had to live with the memory. Memory, that was the final cost. Because long after the courtrooms emptied and the fires cooled, the towns remained haunted, not by ghosts, but by the things people had done to survive. And in that silence, something began to stir. A question, unspoken but growing louder with every passing year. How could we have done this to each other? And deeper still, what did we destroy, not just in them, but in ourselves? The fire did not light itself. The rope did not tie its own knots. Behind every witch trial stood systems, carefully constructed, deeply entrenched, designed to uphold the illusion of justice while hiding something far more sinister: control. And at the heart of that machinery were three pillars, each reinforcing the other, each invested in keeping women silent, compliant, and afraid: the church, the state, and the burgeoning field of medicine. Individually, each held immense influence over daily life in early modern Europe. But together, they created a fortress, one that turned the natural world into something profane, and the female body into something dangerous. It began with a church. The clergy shaped not only people's beliefs about heaven and hell, but their understanding of womanhood itself. From the pulpit, priests thundered sermons warning that women, by nature, were spiritually weaker, more lustful, more susceptible to temptation. Eve's original sin had become every woman's inheritance, a dangerous legacy that could be passed down in silence, in glances, in acts of care. The Malleus Maleficarum, the witch hunter's manual, was written by two Dominican monks. They cited scripture, distorted theology, and quoted saints to prove, page after page, that women were the devil's favorite tool. They claimed that no one sinned as easily or as often, that no one desired knowledge more dangerously, that the female body itself, its blood, its cycles, its mysterious power to create life, was a portal to evil. These weren't fringe beliefs, they were doctrine. Women were taught to fear their instincts, to suppress their desires, to pray constantly for forgiveness. And when that failed, the church offered one more solution: purification through punishment. The burning of witches was, to many clergymen, not an execution, but an exorcism. And then came the state. Governments across Europe, desperate to assert control in times of plague, famine, and unrest, found in witch trials the perfect political tool. Accusations of witchcraft provided a convenient distraction from deeper problems. When crops failed, it wasn't the fault of greedy landlords or climate change. It was the witch. When a nobleman's power was questioned, he could eliminate dissenters by labeling them heretics or sorcerers. Laws were passed to codify these fears. In England, King James III, obsessed with demons and convinced of his divine authority, personally oversaw trials and interrogations. In Germany, local princes sponsored hunts as demonstrations of their godliness. In Switzerland, cantons competed for moral purity by boasting high conviction rates. The state wasn't just complicit, it was enthusiastic, and the punishments were profitable. Confiscated land, fines paid by families, bribes collected during trials. The machinery of accusation made money. Witches didn't just disappear. They left behind homes, possessions, and reputations, all ripe for redistribution. Every execution fed the system, and while the church and state thundered from above, medicine moved in quietly from below. What we now consider modern science was just beginning to take shape during the height of the witch trials. Male physicians, newly trained in universities, sought to professionalize medicine, and that meant eliminating the competition. Midwives, herbalists, women who had been caring for bodies long before men arrived with scalpels and Latin terms. These women were labeled quacks, dangerous, superstitious. Their remedies, once respected, were suddenly suspect. The same sage used to ease cramps became a tool of seduction. The same willow bark that soothed fevers became witches' brew. In some regions, male doctors sat on witch tribunals, reviewing cases and confirming that a woman's knowledge of healing was unnatural. They used their new authority not to save lives, but to discredit and criminalize the very women who had passed down medical wisdom for generations. A woman's body, once sacred in its connection to nature, became a battlefield. And nowhere was this more evident than in childbirth. Before male doctors took over, childbirth was the domain of women. Mothers, midwives, aunts, neighbors. It was a community event, laced with ritual and care. But once the witch hunts took hold, midwifery itself became dangerous. If a birth went wrong, the midwife was blamed. If the child was malformed, she had clearly meddled with dark forces. If the baby died, she had offered it to Satan. In Strasbourg, a midwife was burned because she used warm water and oils during labor, a method passed down through generations. The court argued that easing pain was interfering with God's will. Pain, after all, was seen as divine punishment for Eve's sin. So to ease it? That was heresy. These attitudes didn't vanish with time. They were absorbed, repackaged. In the centuries that followed, women were gradually pushed out of the healing arts altogether, their knowledge dismissed as folklore, their voices muted by textbooks and institutions. And the legacy of that silencing still echoes today. The modern divide between medicine and alternative healing has roots in the witch hunts. So does the ongoing mistrust of female bodies, the pathologizing of menstruation, the stigma around aging. These aren't new problems, they're old shadows. And through it all, one question remains: what did we lose? What wisdom was turned to ash in those fires? What knowledge never made it past the gallows? What cures were forgotten? What songs silenced? We will never know, because the institutions that hunted witches didn't just burn women, they burned memory. They erased generations of experience, intuition, and connection to the natural world, and they replaced it with fear. Fear of female intelligence, fear of bodily autonomy, fear of anything that couldn't be measured, taxed, or controlled. But the truth as a way of surviving, hidden in the soil, whispered in the wind, passed down in fragments. And as history turns its gaze back to those dark centuries, something begins to shift. A reckoning, a remembering, and maybe, finally, a restoration. She didn't leave behind a statue. She didn't get a grave with her name on it. No hymn was sung in her memory. But somehow, she survived. Not in flesh, most were silenced before they reached old age, but in whispers, in fragments, in the unbroken thread of female memory passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, through centuries of silence. The witch hunts in Western Europe may have officially ended by the late 18th century, but the wound they left behind never truly closed. It simply changed form. The fire was extinguished, yes, but the ash remained. And in that ash, a quiet resistance began to grow, because while the world tried to forget the women it burned, some refused to let them disappear. You see, not every accused witch died. A few escaped, fled to forests, disappeared into mountains, assumed new names, or were quietly released after trials collapsed under lack of evidence. These women became ghosts long before their death. They lived in the shadows, untrusted and unspoken of, but not broken. In some places, they became legends. In small alpine villages and Celtic highlands, stories were passed down of wise women who returned after the flames, women who helped heal livestock, predicted storms, whispered to bees. Were they witches? Were they simply old women with knowledge? The line blurred, and in that blurring something powerful remained. The witch became more than an accusation. She became an archetype. Feared, yes, but also remembered. Across generations, girls heard stories of the one who was too clever, too brave, too wild. They learned not to say her name in front of priests, but they listened, and they wondered, what had she really done? Why had knowing too much about plants, or refusing a man, or speaking her mind, been enough to kill her? And slowly the shame began to shift. In the 19th and 20th centuries, feminist thinkers started to revisit the witch trials, not as isolated acts of medieval cruelty, but as systemic erasure of female autonomy. Writers like Matilda Joslyn Gage argued that the witch hunts were a form of gendered genocide, a purge of women who dared to live outside the narrow roles imposed on them. The numbers, often debated, matter less than the intent. Tens of thousands were executed. Many more were tortured, shunned, or psychologically destroyed. But beyond those statistics lies something harder to measure, the silence that followed, the fear that taught generations of women to hide their knowledge, to keep their voices low, to be careful who they helped, to second-guess themselves every time they dared to lead, to speak, to know. It wasn't just death that the witch hunts produced, it was obedience, but not forever. In the 1970s, women's movements across Europe and the Americas began to reclaim the word witch. Protesters carried banners with slogans like, "We are the granddaughters of the witches you couldn't burn." Feminist scholars revisited trial records, not to study the law, but to restore dignity to the accused. Artists painted witches not as monsters, but as rebels, wise, wounded, radiant. The image of the crone, once twisted into a symbol of decay and danger, became one of strength. Women began to gather again, to learn about herbs, birth, and ritual, not to reenact the past, but to reclaim what was taken. And even now, the cultural shadow of the witch trials lingers in unexpected places. Every time a woman is labeled hysterical for expressing anger, every time a female expert is dismissed as too intense, too emotional, or too much, every time a woman is punished for speaking out, for knowing her body, for claiming space, a faint echo of the fire returns. But so too does the flame of the survivor, because there is something enduring about those who were never meant to survive, something defiant, something holy. In Germany, Stolperstein, stumbling stones, have begun to appear with the names of executed witches. In Norway, a 2011 memorial finally apologized for the 91 women killed in Finnmark. In Switzerland, a monument now stands for Anna Goldie, the last woman officially executed for witchcraft in Europe. Cleared of guilt 226 years after her death, these aren't just gestures. They're attempts to write back what was erased. And still, the full truth is elusive. We will never know the names of all who were lost. We will never read the letters they were never allowed to write. We will never know the cures, the songs, the stories buried with them. But we can choose to remember them not as villains, not even as victims, but as warnings. Warnings of what happens when fear replaces thought, when power silences truth, when a woman's knowledge is seen as a threat instead of a gift. And perhaps that's the final legacy. The witch, real or imagined, reminds us that what is feared is often what is most powerful. That knowledge, when stripped of permission, becomes resistance. And that in remembering those who were burned, we ignite something they tried to extinguish: curiosity, voice, connection, truth. They tried to silence her, but centuries later, we're still telling her story. And maybe that's the most powerful spell of all.